Hello, citizens! Welcome to Histories and Mysteries Redux, Exodus, Part 5, where Bill Burris, that's me, talks about the 10 plagues and what else? Geology. What is Histories and Mysteries Redux? I've taken some of the classes from the Histories and Mysteries series that I have taught at the church, and I'm rerunning them here on YouTube. They're modified from their original content to better fit this online environment. And as a result of that editing, we boiled this down to 9. Yes, 9 Histories and Mysteries Redux Exodus classes. So let's pretend we're at the church. Grab that caffeinated beverage of choice. You're probably going to need it. Pretend it's Woody's Fair Trade Blend. That's pretty good, Joe. Let's take a seat in the back of the classroom in good Presbyterian fashion, and then look to the whiteboard. That's on the left-hand side of the class there for the terrible dumb joke. In this case, we put it at the bottom of the slide, and... okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. This is a Christian education presentation, and as such, we've got to start off with a passage, and so we have from Acts 7, verses 35 through 37. It was this Moses whom they rejected when they said, "Who made you a ruler and a judge?" And whom God now sent as both ruler and liberator through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out, having performed wonders and signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and in the wilderness for 40 years. This is the Moses who said to the Israelites, "God will raise up a prophet for you from your own people, as he raised me up." So let's jump into the much dreaded agenda. We're going to start with our opening prayer. We're going to talk about some caveats and disclaimers. And I'm sorry, we're going to have to deal with some geology stuff. And then we're going to get into the 10 plagues. All right, let's get rolling here. So let's get on into the opening prayer. If you know it, say it with me. Dear Lord, even though Bill is teaching us, may we please learn something of value. Amen. So, caveats and disclaimers. There we go. The goofball teaching this class is a geologist. He even has a piece of paper from the government that says so. And as we all know, the government is never wrong. He can be relied on to accurately describe geology, geologic phenomenon, and such with erudite intelligence. All other items, not so much. You've been warned. Oh yeah, there's going to be in this presentation dangerous geology. One of the things that some people view as being so dangerous about geologists is that wherever you have geologists, you have bad geology puns. Yeah, so we might see a few of those during this presentation as well. The sources we're going to be working from: The Miracles of the Exodus by Colin J. Humphreys, The Parting of the Sea by Barbara J. Silvertson, The History of Ancient Egypt, one of the great courses by Bob Breyer. This is a good source of basic ancient Egyptian history. And as we discussed in the last presentation about the new chronology, these are the references to the works of David Rohl. And the final issue for this class and all my classes, when I'm talking about traditional ideas, traditional notions, I'm talking about based on religious texts or religious tradition. For example, if you were to literally read the Bible, you could then estimate that the earth was made 4004 BC, or, less than 10,000 years ago. That's biblical or religious tradition. Conventional, when I'm talking about conventional understanding, I'm talking about if you took modern academics and got them in a room and tried to get some kind of consensus out of them, then that would be a conventional understanding. So for example, conventional understanding that the earth is 4.5 billion years old, according to geologists like myself. This is the greatly feared schedule. So we have covered an introduction and the importance of the Exodus in the Bible. We've talked about basic Egyptian history. We've talked about Joseph and maybe the possible origins of the Israelites. Then we talked about when was the Exodus and the ideas that are introduced in the new chronology. And this week we're going to talk about the 10 plagues and what geology's got to do with it. So, some concepts to start with today. And we're going to start off with geologic rifts. So let's get a little bit into plate tectonics. Geologists understand that the crust, the lithosphere, the hard outer shell of the Earth, is made up of a section of plates, and these plates are bumping and grinding and moving around over time. So there are two types of crust, or plates, if you will. There's thick continental crust. We call these the continental plates. And then there's thin oceanic crust. The rock layers that are underneath the oceans tend to be very, very thin compared to the rocks that are on the crust. We have seismic data that indicates that this is the case. And there are three general types of boundaries that occur between plates. So if you have two plates and they're at a boundary condition between them, they're bumping into each other, then one of the conditions is collision. One plate is colliding with another. And then at the ocean type areas, that means that one plate is sliding underneath another. And if it's two continents smashing into each other, then you're going to make a giant mountain range like the Himalayas. Another type of boundary between plates is extension, where you're actually breaking the plate apart or pulling the plate apart, or the two plates apart, and there's a boundary between them. That is an extension or a rift. And lastly, where you have two plates grinding against each other, that is what we refer to as transform, or a transform boundary. A little more on all of this here in a bit. So what's happening in the area around Egypt? So here we are, we're going to have this fancy little pen tool, see if this works. The African plate, a large continental plate, is over here. And we have a smaller plate called the Arabian plate, that's continental crust over here. And in between these two plates, we have this nice linear feature, which we call the Red Sea. And that is a rift. That means that there is one plate moving this way, and one plate moving this way, and they are pulling apart, and new oceanic crust is being formed kind of in the middle there, and that is a rift. The Red Sea Rift is part of the world's largest rift system, the Great Rift Valley in Africa. And so here we have the Red Sea Rift up here, and it is part and associated with the Great Rift Valley here, where parts of East Africa are doing their best to separate from the rest of Africa. And I'm not talking politically, I'm talking physically. It is trying to move its way into the Indian Ocean. And over enough time, this will all become new ocean here over the next few million years. So the Red Sea is part of this rift system, as is the Gulf of Aden right here. And notice all these little triangles, these are volcanoes. So, volcanoes are common in rift systems, both continental and in ocean rift systems. Meanwhile, in the Aegean Sea, north of Egypt, in the Greek islands area, we have collision going on, where you have plates here, in this case it's the African plate, moving northward, and they are being subducted. They are sliding underneath the trenches to the north, the Aegean Sea plate to the north. And we'll see a little picture of that here in just a moment. So here's an example of it right here in this area here, where ocean crust is subducting, going down underneath, and as it goes down, you're getting melting, and you start getting a series of volcanoes, which we call island arcs. So have you actually ever heard of the Minoans? The Minoans were a civilization that existed and was based around Crete in the Aegean Sea. They built a big palace in Knossos, and this is the palace that is associated with the Minotaur and the Labyrinth of legend. Why did the Minoan civilization go into decline and actually fade away? Well, most archaeologists and historians blame the eruption of a volcano, a giant volcanic eruption on the island of Santorini, we call it the Thera eruption. This is one of the biggest volcanic eruptions that occurred in the last 5,000 years or so. It was enormous, and it hurled ash over a huge amount of distance. It was a giant explosive eruption. It would have probably killed almost everybody that was on the all the Minoans that were living on that island at the time. We do know that there were, archaeology has shown that there were villages and small towns on that island, as well as pretty much burying major other portions of the Minoan civilization under a substantial amount of ash, and it's presumed that all the climatic disruptions as a result of this eruption is one of the things that probably launched the Minoan civilization into a state of decline. So when was the Thera eruption? Archaeologists using pottery data argue that maybe around 1500 BC. Geologists using radioisotope data argue is 1628 to 1690 BC, with the weight of evidence closer to the 1628 date. And during this giant event, there would have been huge earthquakes, large tsunamis would have also resulted. This is a giant, huge, spectacular explosion that happens in the middle of the Aegean Sea. That places the Thera eruption within the second intermediate period of our timeline. So the second intermediate period is shown to start just around 1630 BC under a traditional Egyptian time frame. All right, yeah, okay, another geology joke. Yep. To summarize, there's a lot of geology going on around Egypt. And now let's get on with the main show. So let's go through the 10 plagues, the 10 plagues of Egypt. So the first plague is the waters of the Nile turns to blood. The second plague is frogs. The third plague is gnats or lice. The fourth plague, swarms of flies. The fifth plague, animals get sick and die. The sixth plague, boils form on the skin. The seventh plague, fire and hail. The eighth plague, locusts. The ninth plague, darkness. And the 10th plague, firstborn boys die. So, is it possible to explain these plagues with science? Well, some people like to think so. Why would some people want to explain these plagues using science? Some argue that if you can explain these plagues using science, it will actually support the biblical narrative. It helps prove the veracity of the Old Testament. Some don't like the concept of using science to explain these plagues because then it detracts away from the miraculous. Okay, the idea is that these are miracles by God, and if you explain it with science, then they're no longer miracles. So let's start with turning the Nile to blood. Exodus 7, verse 16 through 18. Say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to say, let my people go, so that they may worship me in the wilderness. But until now you have not listened. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. See, with the staff that it is in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall be turned to blood. The fish in the river shall die, the river itself shall stink, and the Egyptians shall be unable to drink the water of the Nile. Well, here's a scientific explanation. Iron-rich volcanic ash and sediment from an eruption of a volcano upstream from the Nile, somewhere in the Great Rift Valley, perhaps. Is there any kind of precedent for this? Well, it's not a direct precedent, but there was a huge environmental catastrophe in Hungary where a lot of residual tailings and material from an iron ore processing plant, a tailings pond, broke, the dam broke, and all this red acidic water that had all this iron tailings in it just covered and flooded the whole countryside and stained everything this kind of crimson red color due to the iron-rich nature or the color of the material that was captured in this sediment train. It's the same sort of thing here. The idea would be that you'd have red volcanic ash, rich in iron, flooding down the Nile Valley as a result of some kind of volcanic eruption further upstream. Another explanation that's been proposed, and that is red tide. That is red algae blooms. These algae are toxic and will kill the fish and will kill people who eat the fish. It's very, very bad stuff, the red tide, and it's no fun. And maybe there was some kind of red algae bloom that occurred in the Nile River. Red tide, though, has a certain amount of problems with it. There have been no known incidences of freshwater red tide. It's always been in the ocean. But some people argue, well, maybe you had a tsunami, and that tsunami had occurred, maybe as a result of the Thera eruption, and pushed the red tide up the Nile River. Well, let's take a next look at frogs. Exodus 8, chapter 8, verse 12. Then Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried out to the Lord concerning the frogs that he had brought upon Pharaoh, and the Lord did as Moses requested. The frogs died in the houses, the courtyards, and the fields, and they gathered them together in heaps, and the land stank. Well, if you're going to have the river turning to blood, then it's obvious that the frogs don't want to hang out in the yucky water anymore, and where else are they going to go? Then the third, gnats. Then Exodus 8. Then the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth so that it may become gnats throughout the whole land of Egypt. And they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and gnats came on humans and animals alike. All the dust of the earth turned into gnats throughout the whole land of Egypt. Well, first of all, we have a translation issue that we have to argue about. When they use that word, are they talking about gnats? Or are they talking about lice? Or fleas? Or maybe some other type of biting insect? Then we go to flies, Exodus 8. Then the Lord said to Moses, rise early in the morning and present yourself before Pharaoh as he goes out to the water, and say to him, thus says the Lord, let my people go so that they may worship me. For if you will not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies on you, your officials and your people, and into your houses, and the houses of the Egyptians shall be filled with swarms of flies, so also the land where they lived. Now, what kind of flies? Some of the flies that are attributed as being pests in Egypt are sand flies or stable flies. These are the kind that are often associated with biting people and being annoying to people. And it has been suggested that the flies in the Exodus are some kind of biting flies, and that these are the kind of flies who would carry some form of pestilence. Why? Because the livestock then get all sick in the next plague. Exodus 9, chapters 1 through 4. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go so that they may worship me. For if you refuse to let them go and still hold them, the hand of the Lord will strike with a deadly pestilence your livestock in the field, the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing shall die of all that belongs to the Israelites. So can you get diseases from flies? There are many known livestock diseases that are actually transmitted through insects. Why so many insects? Well, duh. There are no frogs left to keep the insect population down. Then follows that is the plague of boils, Exodus 9. And then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of soot from the kiln and let Moses throw it in the air in the sight of Pharaoh. It shall become fine dust over all the land of Egypt, and shall cause festering boils on humans and animals throughout the whole land of Egypt. So they took soot from the kiln and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw it in the air, and it caused festering boils on humans and animals. What was this? Some form of bad acne or something? Or some other form of more virulent disease? Maybe smallpox. Maybe it's a pestilence caused by insect bites. Bubonic plague has been suggested, as it can cause boils, and they're spread by fleas. Then comes the next plague, thunder and hail. Exodus 9, bear with me, it's a little long here. Part 22, or verse 22. The Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven so that hail may fall on the whole land of Egypt, on humans and animals and all the plants of the field in the land of Egypt. Then Moses stretched out his staff toward heaven, and the Lord set thunder and hail, and fire came down on the earth. And the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. There was hail with fire flashing continually in the midst of it, such heavy hail as had never fallen in the land of Egypt since it became a nation. The hail struck down everything that was in the open field through all the land of the Egypt, both human and animal. The hail also struck down all the plants of the field and shattered every tree in the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were, where there was no hail. Could this actually be referring to the Thera eruption? Listen to it. It's hail and fire. How about fiery ash, hot rocks coming from the sky? And if you're going to have hot rocks, maybe it's coming from the Thera eruption. Next, locusts. Exodus chapter 10, verses 12 and on. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the land of Egypt, so that locusts may come upon it and eat every plant in the land, all that the hail has left. So Moses stretched out his staff over the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought an east wind upon the land all that day and all that night. When morning came, the east wind had brought the locusts. The locusts came upon all the land of Egypt and settled on the whole country of Egypt. Such a dense swarm of locusts as had never been before, nor shall ever be again. Locust plagues are natural in North Africa and are all too common. Locusts go from a stage of being hoppers and jumpers and just to swarm over the land, eating everything in sight, and then they get to the point where they actually develop wings and start flying as a swarm. And they can just wipe out whole areas, destroy crops everywhere. And lastly, darkness, Exodus 10. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven so that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness that can be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was dense darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. People could not see one another, and for 3 days they could not move from where they were, but all the Israelites had light where they lived. The plague of darkness. Well, what could be the source of that? Could it be ash clouds from a volcano blocking out the sun? It's a good geologist explanation. How about a desert sandstorm as well as a cloud of ash? These can be quite devastating and can be in times quite long lasting, and it's very, very hard to see when you're in the midst of one of these storms. Then at last the 10th plague, death of the firstborn. Exodus chapter 12. At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. So, anyone got any explanations for this? How about food poisoning? How about all kinds of food polluted during the times of darkness and the plagues and so on and so forth? Maybe it was by a black mold. And when people emerged after the darkness, the firstborn would be given priority. Hey, you're hungry? We'll give you the food. And consequently more likely affected by any toxin or disease carried by that food. Meanwhile, the Israelites ate food prepared and eaten very quickly and would have been less likely to have been contaminated, because they knew it was coming, so to speak. Another argument that some people have put forward is the idea of carbon dioxide poisoning. That there was a release of carbon dioxide that had erupted from the river. It was trapped in the river Nile, probably as a result of maybe decaying fish and biological matter that as a result of all the previous plagues. And as a result of this eruption of carbon dioxide gas asphyxiated anyone who happened to be living on the lower levels of a house. And the argument goes is that maybe in Egypt the firstborn had preferential treatment and got to sleep on the first floors while everyone else got to sleep up above, and as a result they were wiped out by carbon dioxide poisoning. Is this even possible? Well, there are at least one known incident of carbon dioxide poisoning, and this occurred in Cameroon in a volcanic lake where volcanic gas, carbon dioxide, formed and dissolved into the deeper parts of the lake water, and then some kind of disruption occurred, and then the whole lake bubbled up like a giant soda bottle, releasing huge amounts of carbon dioxide gas in the night, and then all the surrounding villages and low-lying areas around the lake were actually deprived of oxygen and asphyxiated tons of people and livestock. This all occurred in 1986. So at least that's possible at some degree or other. So let's summarize. The 10 plagues could have been caused by a series of natural events, often linked to volcanoes. Does this make them more or less miraculous if that's the case? And finally, if you're going to link this stuff to geology, remember, no rocks, no ice cream. In other words, you can't have rocks, you don't have soil. If you don't have soil, you don't have grass. If you don't have grass, you don't have cows. And if you don't have cows, you don't have ice cream. So no rocks, no ice cream. Or, by James Hutton, a great geologist, a leader in the 1800s, who claimed civilization exists by geologic consent. Next week, we are going to go even more into geology. I know you're really looking forward to it. I certainly am. I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sticking with us during these challenging times.